Welcome to today's lesson on the consequences of climate change for humans and environments. In previous lessons, we have looked at what climate change is, why it is happening, and some of the physical impacts, such as rising sea levels, melting ice, and more extreme weather. Today, we are going to focus on the real-world consequences. Climate change is not just about temperature graphs or melting glaciers. It affects people's homes, food supplies, water access, ecosystems, economies, and futures. Some communities are already facing more frequent droughts, floods, wildfires, and crop failures. Some ecosystems are already being pushed towards collapse. Some people are already having to leave their homes because the places they live are becoming unsafe. In this lesson, we will look at food and water security, climate migration, biodiversity loss, mitigation strategies, and international agreements. The big question for today is, how does a warming planet affect people, places, and ecosystems, and what can be done about it? Let's begin with the learning objectives. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to do four things. First, you should be able to evaluate the risks to food security and water availability. Food security means having reliable access to enough safe and nutritious food. Water availability means whether people have enough clean water for drinking, farming, hygiene, and industry. Second, you should be able to analyze the causes of climate-induced migration. This means understanding why people may be forced to leave their homes because of drought, flooding, sea level rise, coastal erosion, wildfires, or crop failure. Third, you should be able to explain how climate change leads to a loss of biodiversity. Biodiversity means the variety of plant and animal life. Climate change can damage habitats, shift ecosystems, and increase extinction risk. Finally, you should be able to assess global mitigation strategies and international agreements. Mitigation means reducing greenhouse gas emissions to limit future climate change. We will look at alternative energy, carbon capture, afforestation, and the Paris Agreement. So today's lesson is about consequences, but it is also about solutions. Before we go further, let's go through the key vocabulary. The first word is mitigation. Mitigation means actions taken to reduce or prevent greenhouse gas emissions. For example, switching from coal power to wind or solar power is mitigation because it reduces emissions. The second word is sustainability. Sustainability means meeting the needs of people today without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. In climate change, this means using resources and energy in ways that do not damage the planet for the future. The third word is biodiversity. Biodiversity means the variety of plant and animal life in a habitat, ecosystem, or across the whole world. A rainforest has high biodiversity because it contains many different species. The fourth word is adaptation. Adaptation means making adjustments in response to climate change impacts. For example, building seawalls, developing drought-resistant crops, or creating wildfire evacuation plans are forms of adaptation. These terms are important because climate change responses are often divided into two categories. Mitigation reduces the causes of climate change. Adaptation deals with the impacts of climate change. Before we look at the human and environmental costs, let's recap the physical impacts of climate change. One major impact is sea level rise. Sea levels are rising for two main reasons. The first is thermal expansion. As ocean water warms, it expands. Because warmer water takes up more space, sea levels rise. The second is the melting of land ice, such as glaciers and ice sheets. When this ice melts, the water flows into the oceans and increases sea level. Sea level rise creates serious risks for coastal communities. It can increase coastal flooding, erosion, and storm surge damage. Climate change is also linked to more extreme weather. This can include more intense storms, heavier rainfall, droughts, heat waves, and wildfires. These physical impacts matter because they create consequences for people and ecosystems. For example, a drought is a physical event, but its consequences may include crop failure, food shortages, and migration. So today we are moving from physical impacts to human and environmental impacts. Let's check your understanding. Question 1. What is the process where sea levels rise because ocean water warms and expands? Question 2. Which type of ice melt contributes most to sea level rise? Sea ice or terrestrial, land-based ice? Question 3. True or false? Extreme weather events like hurricanes are becoming less frequent due to climate change. Take a moment to think through your answers. Remember, sea ice is already floating in the ocean, while land ice adds new water to the ocean when it melts. Let's go through the answers. For question 1, the answer is thermal expansion. This is when warming ocean water expands and takes up more space, contributing to sea level rise. For question 2, the answer is terrestrial ice, meaning land ice such as glaciers and ice sheets. When land ice melts, the water flows into the ocean and raises sea levels. For question 3, the answer is false. Extreme weather events such as hurricanes are not becoming less frequent due to climate change. They are becoming more intense, and in some cases more frequent. This matters because physical changes in the climate system create direct risks for people, economies, and natural environments. Now let's look at food and water. Climate change is a major threat to food security and water availability. Farming depends on predictable weather. Crops need the right amount of rainfall, the right temperatures, and stable growing seasons. Climate change disrupts these patterns. In some areas, rainfall becomes less reliable. Droughts may become more common, leaving crops without enough water. In other areas, rainfall may become too intense, causing floods that wash away soil, damage crops, and destroy infrastructure. Higher temperatures can also reduce crop yields. Crops such as rice and maize are sensitive to heat stress. If temperatures rise too much during key growing stages, yields can fall. This is especially serious in parts of Africa and Asia, where many people rely on farming for food and income. Water availability is also affected. Drought can reduce river levels, reservoirs, and groundwater supplies. Glaciers that supply rivers may shrink. At the same time, hotter temperatures increase evaporation, meaning more water is lost from soil and reservoirs. The result can be a growing crisis: less reliable food production, less clean water, and more people facing insecurity. Now let's think about what happens when a place becomes too dangerous or too difficult to live in. The slide asks, what happens when your land is either underwater or too dry to farm? For many people, the answer is migration. Climate change can create environmental refugees. These are people forced to leave their homes because sudden or gradual environmental changes are making life unsafe or impossible. Some people may be displaced suddenly by disasters such as floods, storms, or wildfires. Others may be displaced gradually by slower changes, such as sea level rise, desertification, coastal erosion, or declining crop yields. For example, a farming community may leave because rainfall has become too unreliable to grow crops. A coastal community may leave because homes are repeatedly flooded or eroded. A family may leave because wildfires have made their area unsafe. The presentation notes that by 2050, it is estimated that upwards of 200 million people could be displaced by climate-related factors. This is not only an environmental issue. It is also a social, economic, and political issue. Migration can place pressure on housing, jobs, healthcare, education, and international borders. It can also create difficult questions about responsibility and support. Now let's test a common assumption. The statement says, climate change is only a push factor for migration in low-income countries. Is that true or false? A push factor is something that forces or encourages people to leave a place. Climate change can certainly be a powerful push factor in low-income countries, especially where people have fewer resources to adapt. But is it only a problem in low-income countries? Think about coastal erosion in the UK. Think about wildfires in the USA, Australia, or Southern Europe. Think about flooding in wealthy cities. Climate change affects all countries, even though the level of vulnerability may be different. So is the statement true or false? The statement is false. Climate change is not only a push factor in low-income countries. It affects all nations. However, the impacts are often worse for people who have fewer resources, weaker infrastructure, or less government support. For example, coastal erosion can force people in parts of the UK to move away from the coast. Wildfires can displace people in the USA, Canada, Australia, and Southern Europe. Flooding can affect both low-income and high-income countries. The difference is often the ability to adapt. A wealthy country may have more money for flood defenses, insurance systems, emergency services, and rebuilding. A poorer country may have fewer resources to respond. making the same hazard far more damaging. So a balanced answer would say, climate change affects migration globally, but vulnerability is uneven. The correct explanation is B. Climate change affects all nations. For example, coastal erosion in the UK and wildfires in the USA are already displacing people. This is an important point because climate change is a global issue. It is not something happening only far away or only in poorer countries. However, not all countries and communities are affected equally. Some people live in high-risk areas such as low-lying islands, floodplains, drought-prone regions, or wildfire zones. Some people have fewer resources to protect themselves or recover after disasters. So when we talk about climate migration, we should think about both the physical hazard and the social vulnerability. A place becomes especially at risk when climate hazards combine with poverty, poor infrastructure, weak planning, or limited access to support. Now let's move from human impacts to environmental impacts. Climate change threatens ecosystems and biodiversity. An ecosystem is a community of living organisms interacting with each other and with their physical environment. Ecosystems are delicate webs. If one species declines or disappears, it can affect many others. One major example is coral bleaching. Corals have a close relationship with tiny algae that live inside them. These algae provide corals with food and color. When ocean temperatures rise, corals become stressed and expel the algae. This causes the coral to turn white, which is called coral bleaching. If temperatures stay too high for too long, the coral can die. This is serious because coral reefs support around 25% of marine life. If coral reefs are damaged, many fish, plants, and other marine species lose their habitats. Climate change also causes shifting habitats. As temperatures rise, some species move towards the poles or to higher altitudes in search of cooler conditions. But not all species can move. Some are trapped by geography, urban development, or the speed of climate change. Species that cannot adapt or migrate may face extinction. Some ecosystems may reach tipping points. A tipping point is a threshold where a small amount of additional change can cause a major and possibly irreversible shift. One example is the Amazon rainforest. The Amazon helps create its own rainfall through evapotranspiration. Trees release water vapor into the atmosphere, which helps maintain rainfall across the region. But if too much forest is lost through deforestation, drought, and climate change, the system may begin to fail. At a certain point, parts of the rainforest could shift towards a drier savanna-like ecosystem. This would mean huge biodiversity loss, reduced carbon storage, and major impacts on rainfall patterns. The quote on the slide reminds us that biodiversity loss can be harder to notice than rising temperature. You can feel a heat wave. You can see a flood. But biodiversity loss may happen quietly until an ecosystem is already severely damaged. This is why biodiversity loss is sometimes described as a silent crisis. Once a species becomes extinct, it cannot be brought back. Now let's look at solutions. To avoid the worst impacts of climate change, the world needs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This is called mitigation. One mitigation strategy is alternative energy. This means replacing fossil fuels such as coal, oil, and gas with low-carbon or renewable energy sources such as wind, solar, hydroelectric, and tidal power. If electricity is produced without burning fossil fuels, fewer greenhouse gases are released into the atmosphere. Another strategy is carbon capture. Carbon capture technology traps carbon dioxide from power stations or industrial processes before it enters the atmosphere. The captured carbon can then be stored underground. This could help reduce emissions from industries that are difficult to decarbonize. A third strategy is afforestation. Afforestation means planting trees. Trees absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere during photosynthesis and store carbon in their trunks, branches, roots, and soils. However, afforestation must be done carefully. Planting the wrong trees in the wrong places can damage ecosystems or reduce water availability. So mitigation is not one single solution. It requires many strategies working together. Climate change is a global problem, so it requires global cooperation. Greenhouse gases do not stay neatly within national borders. Emissions from one country affect the whole atmosphere and therefore the whole planet. This is why international agreements are important. In 2015, nearly 200 countries signed the Paris Agreement. The aim of the agreement is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and ideally to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This matters because the impacts of climate change become more severe as temperatures rise. International agreements can encourage countries to set emissions targets, invest in cleaner energy, and support adaptation. However, there are challenges. Countries have different levels of wealth, different energy needs, and different historical responsibilities for emissions. Some countries may rely heavily on fossil fuels for jobs and economic growth. Others may be highly vulnerable to climate change despite contributing very little to global emissions. So international agreements are vital, but they are also difficult to negotiate and enforce. Now let's apply your knowledge. The question is, which consequence of climate change do you think is the most difficult for the international community to solve? Food security, environmental refugees, or the loss of biodiversity? Explain your reasoning. This is an evaluation question. There is no single correct answer, but you need to justify your choice. You might choose food security. Food security is difficult because farming depends on rainfall, temperature, soil, water supply, trade, and political stability. A drought in one region can affect food prices globally. You might choose environmental refugees. This is difficult because migration involves borders, laws, housing, employment, identity, and human rights. Countries may disagree over who is responsible for helping displaced people. You might choose biodiversity loss. This is difficult because extinction is irreversible. Once a species disappears, it is gone forever. Ecosystems are also complex, so losing one species can create knock-on effects that are hard to predict. A strong answer should explain why your chosen consequence is difficult and compare it briefly with the others. You might have said that environmental refugees are the most difficult consequence to solve. That is a strong answer because migration involves complex international border laws, political tensions, and questions about responsibility. You might have said food security is hardest. That is also valid because food production is affected by unpredictable weather, drought, floods, and global trade networks. You might have said biodiversity loss is hardest. This is a very strong argument because biodiversity loss can be irreversible. If a species becomes extinct, it cannot simply be replaced. Extinction can damage food chains and destabilize ecosystems. The best answers will make a clear judgment. For example, biodiversity loss may be the most difficult consequence to solve because extinction is permanent. Food insecurity and migration can be managed through aid, planning, and international cooperation, although this is challenging. However, once a species disappears, the damage to ecosystems may be irreversible. That answer is strong because it compares consequences and reaches a reasoned conclusion. Let's finish by thinking about the future. The challenges of climate change are serious, but the future is not fixed. The transition to a more sustainable world is already underway in many places. Countries are investing in renewable energy. Cities are improving public transport and reducing emissions. Communities are planting trees, protecting wetlands, restoring habitats, and preparing for extreme weather. Individuals can also play a role, especially by advocating for wider change. The final reflection question is, what is one change you can advocate for in your community to aid mitigation? You might suggest more renewable energy in schools or public buildings. You might suggest better public transport or safer cycling routes. You might suggest tree planting, reducing food waste, improving recycling, or protecting local green spaces. The important point is that mitigation is not only about individual choices. It is also about collective action, community planning, business decisions, and government policy. Every action that reduces emissions or protects ecosystems contributes to a more sustainable future.